Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making the time to join us today on our first Ethics Lab webinar for the year. My name is Anya Nyamjo, and I'm a Senior Research Officer here at the Ethics Lab. And this webinar forms part of a range of activities that I coordinate around our research development program, which is built around leveraging the African humanities to think about the ethical questions posed by new and emerging health technologies. I just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will subsequently be archived on our website. So typically that often means you may or may not be comfortable with having your camera on. I do hope that when we eventually do move to the question and answer session, you can or the discussion session, sorry, you can maybe put on your camera to ask a question, but you're also obviously welcome to put it in the chat or keep your camera off if you would prefer. And then I guess a final point on just how today is going to go is that our speaker is going to speak for about 25 to half an hour, and then the rest of the session will be dedicated to a discussion. So on to today's webinar. Very delighted to be joined by Erin Kinghorn, who is a science communicator and research communications officer specializing in African genomics, personalized medicine, and ethical and culturally aware communication. And her work integrates evidence-based messaging, creative storytelling to bridge the gap between researchers, clinicians, and policymakers and the public. And today's discussion, I would say, is broadly around sort of the ethical questions posed by artificial intelligence in science communication. I think we can almost, at the risk of being overly reductive, we can see this in two ways, right? One where, AI is the object of communication. So how we talk and represent AI and its capabilities, which the title of Erin's presentation speaks to, but also the role of AI as a science communicator and AI as a mediator of scientific knowledge. So yeah, those are broadly sort of the spectrum of things we want to hold today. And so without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Erin. Erin, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you for such a lovely intro. And I'm super excited to be on the webinar platform. I think it's such an exciting opportunity, and I'm sure there's going to be some really cool conversations that are had. So yeah, let's get into it. So as Anya said, I'm going to be chatting a little bit about what AI looks like in the space that I currently work in, and yeah, where we're moving forward and what my thoughts are on the topic. So I want to start off my talk today with a deceptively simple question. And that is that when we talk about personalized medicine, I want to ask, whose version of personal are we actually really talking about? And so before I get into all of the nitty-gritty of everything, I feel like I just need to give a general disclaimer that I am not against AI in any way, shape, or form. I work with it every day. Now that my professional role has sort of evolved, I'm learning lots of new things about AI and using it in ways that I didn't think I would be. And I do rely on it in my work. And so, I mean, even in my background in the research that I've done in human genetics, I used AI as a technical tool to help manage complexity and sort of aggregate data and stuff. So, I mean, I just also feel like it's worth mentioning that today's talk will sort of come from a lens of genomics. That's my background, and so it's where I feel most comfortable. And so from that and from my research that I did in my master's, what sort of became a concern to me wasn't really the use of AI within these spaces, but rather what happens when different kinds of AIs sort of begin to explain genetics outside of research. And that sort of prompted me to be where I am now. And this is because not all AI and genomics does the same work or reaches the same audience. And so when it moves out of this sort of supporting structure that you might find in a more expert space, the stakes can change. And so that's where this question really becomes unavoidable. And I almost want to press even further to ask, as AI increasingly mediates how personalized medicine is explained and understood, whose data is it drawing from, and ultimately whose story is being told. And so within genomics, maybe it's worth explaining that there's sort of layers of AI. So it works well because it operates inside a scaffold of expertise within the genomic space. So when we use AI supported platforms for things like variant interpretation, we're engaging with structured analytical systems that are sort of designed for quote unquote expert use. And these are, subscription based and require some sort of professional, not professional training, but a sort of understanding of what you're looking at. And the purpose of them is to surface evidence, but they already assume that the user knows how to interpret it. So this is a screenshot from one of these platforms. And here, we're not looking for an answer in isolation. Instead, we're like weighing up things like population frequencies, functional data, inheritance patterns, literature. And the system that we use supports this sort of expert reasoning, but it doesn't replace it. We know how to read these outputs. And so we might know where evidence is strong and where it's thin, and we might know when a variant is uncertain rather than informative. And we know things that, for instance, that like ancestry context can change how confidence should be interpreted, and all of this sort of contextual understanding where this data has been brought together using an AI aggregate tool. But my question is then, what happens when that scaffold disappears? Because alongside these expert systems, there's another layer of AI, like language models that anyone can access for free and instantly. And so what about the person that has no genetic training and is trying to understand maybe a family member or their own diagnosis, or someone researching an unexplained symptom, or maybe a parent searching late at night for meaning or clarity? And that person is definitely not going to be using tools like the one on the previous slide, that tool called Franklin. And they're most definitely going to be using a general purpose AI system like ChatGPT or Gemini to ask questions like this. What does this genetic result mean? And is this inherited? And does my ancestry explain this? And what's the standard protocol for this? And in these moments, AI isn't really functioning as an expert decision support structure. It becomes a proxy for expertise itself. And so while these systems can sound, confident and coherent, they can't really signal when explanations rest on like incomplete data or population gaps or assumptions that matter much more deeply than I think people realize, especially in an African genomic context. And this isn't to say that like ChatGPT sucks or anything like that, because they're definitely not useless. They just can't see what is missing. And so this is where the African genomics sort of sits in the center of the conversation. And despite Africa being home to like the greatest human genetic diversity, African populations are really underrepresented in many global genomic reference data sets. And this affects lots of things like variant classification, disease association studies, and just confidence in which risk can be communicated. And this is across both expert tools and public-facing AI explanations. And so, there definitely are big and important efforts working to change this. African-led sequencing initiatives, there's regional biobanks and lots of collaborative consortia that are definitely working and expanding the knowledge base and building capacity where it matters most. However, and unfortunately, when placed alongside just the sheer scale of already existing non-African data sets and publications, etc., the speed and combined with the speed at which AI systems are trained and reused and repurposed across platforms, the efforts in Africa are still outweighed. And so that's why I've sort of got this elephant versus an ant situation, where at the moment, the ant is not going to outweigh the elephant on the scale. And this creates a little bit of tension. And so again, I want to just bring you back to the slide and just say that, I mean, in expert hands, this imbalance is visible and managed. And so you can see how an expert would be able to carry their understanding across into a more public-facing AI and be able to recognize certain gaps that one might see. But in AI explanations that are delivered directly to the public, this is often invisible. I mean, people wouldn't know what to look for. And so this is how careful findings can really sort of collapse into statements that sound more definitive. Some good examples would be like that finding a single variant might provide an answer, or that ancestry could explain disease, or that population level patterns can sort of apply across a group of people. And so I just felt I needed to point out that the distinction between what we know, what we suspect, and what we can't yet say can easily be lost. And this is especially when explanations move from these specialist tools into general AI systems that weren't really designed for this nuance. And that loss matters. The fault line, I mean, is definitely not the technical accuracy, it's the meaning. And so across both types of AI, something important can be lost once outputs are translated into everyday language. And I mean, why is this? It's mostly, I mean, plainly because AI just doesn't understand how people interpret information when it becomes personal. It doesn't recognize how things like genetic explanations can intersect with someone's identity or history or inequality. And that doesn't even, stay with genetics. It goes across the board, obviously. But it doesn't know how easily probability can be mistaken for certainty. And so in African context specifically, this can lead to some oversimplified narratives, ones that, like biology, can explain outcomes shaped by your environment, and that genetic difference might imply risk, and that ancestry becomes a shortcut explanation for very complex realities. And I mean, AI is not doing it because it hates us, and this isn't a claim that AI intends to make. But it's meaning that people can walk away with, and particularly when public-facing AI explanations are generated without the guardrails that sort of exist in expert environments. And so this is why I think that ethics in AI-driven personalized medicine can't stop at algorithms. It can't be the only thing that's used, and it must sort of extend into how knowledge moves between systems. I think it's important for people to think about that, how from specialist analyst tools into public interpretation, how that message is being carried over. And so this is where something like science communication, where that comes into the equation. So I just want to say, I mean, I don't think science communication is the be all end all and the golden ticket and all of that. I think the work is very multidisciplinary. There's lots of stakeholders, role players, there's lots of moving parts. But I think one thing that science communication can do is, firstly, not oppose AI. It works with AI by restoring what models can't provide on their own across both expert-facing and public-facing systems. And so this is like sort of where the human quietly enters the chat again, because I mean, many professionals, and I'm sure most of you will agree, you already do this instinctively when you use AI yourself. I mean, you pause, you question, you reframe, you might correct some outputs based on experience or on context, and you might type a message and say, no, that's not what I meant. And then it, sort of works from there. And you probably don't do this consciously, but I think you could label this as science communication. So the difference here is that this human judgment often disappears once explanations leave expert spaces, unfortunately. And so where AI excels at synthesis and scale, science communication reintroduces judgment and framing and responsibility. And specifically, it can reintroduce uncertainty where AI might smooth it away. It might name the limits of data sets and models explicitly. It can distinguish between a biological signal from a historical artifact, maybe. And I think most importantly, it can sort of anticipate how a result might be interpreted or misinterpreted outside of a specific space. So in African genomics, this really is not optional, because African genetic data has too often been extracted, I think, without any narrative control, interpreted elsewhere, and sort of returned as conclusions rather than a conversation. And so that's why I have this picture of a helicopter, because there's a name for it. Helicopter science is a pretty good one. And I mean, you can just visualize the movement. But anyway, so I feel like science communication is one of those few places where this pattern can be interrupted. And so this brings us back to the whole sort of good data in, good data out, or bad data in, bad data out situation. But we'll focus on the good and the nice golden presence. Because I mean, this isn't done through simplification or you know, or anything like that. It's through context and through things like institutional websites, reports, and guidance that sort of situate findings within African histories and realities. Well, I've said two words at the same time there. And I mean, these are efforts that need to be fueled from a space that is lived within that context, to allow for better engagement and questions and reflection and correction, for sure. So I think importantly, what I want to just show on this slide is that this work sort of feeds back into AI systems itself. So the language we normalize and the explanations we prioritize, and you know, the narratives we correct, ultimately are going to influence training data and evaluation standards and expectations across both, again, specialist tools and general purpose models. And so science communication really helps determine not really just how AI is understood, but what kinds of explanations become standard. And more importantly, I think it becomes a way to ask, you know, who benefits from this interpretation, who bears the risk if it's wrong, and who gets to tell the story that emerges from the data. So what does this look like in practice? This is sort of something that I'm excited to discuss with you all if you have perspectives to offer after the talk. And I think that it means recognizing that ethical responsibility spans multiple AI layers. And I think that it is important that that's recognized so that effort can be put in across the spaces, across platforms, to, you know, do the greater good and benefit across the board. So for expert systems, this might mean designing tools that can surface population limitations early, or embedding ancestry context into some analytical outputs, not just like in the side notes. And for public-facing AI, it means like building explanations that signal uncertainty and avoiding population generalizations without the context. And ensuring that African genomic data isn't oversimplified as it moves into general knowledge spaces. And it also means supporting African-led data governance and sequencing initiatives and benefit sharing frameworks that's alongside communication strategies, so that, you know, this can travel as far and wide as the technology itself is traveling. And this is, you know, this is because responsibility does not sit with one group. I think that's very important to point out, and is that, you know, researchers can help shape the data, developers can help shape the systems, communicators can help shape interpretation, and then ultimately institutions help shape trust. And obviously those are the basic examples, but And there's definitely more role players for sure. But the challenge now is ensuring that, our ethical framing scales at the same pace as AI-driven personalized medicine. And for those of us who use AI daily, it means, having that little, oh, let me just pause quickly and asking, what assumptions are our tools carrying forward? Which explanations are we comfortable releasing into the world? And who carries the consequences if they are misunderstood? And so I want to just end with this. I might be a little bit early, but I tend to speak quite fast. So, personalized medicine holds extraordinary promise, and AI in its many forms is, it's undeniably a part of that future. And so this sort of started and stemmed from my move from technical genetics into science communication, and it came from seeing how easily that meaning can just slip even when the science is sound. And once AI becomes the voice explaining it, I'm sure everyone can relate to what I've said, where you might have Googled, or not Googled, maybe even Googled something that you already knew the answer to just to double check yourself. And it sort of stems from that space of, AI can't necessarily explain things in the way that is as absorbable for the human brain. And I just think that, if African communities are expected to trust AI-driven medicine, then nuance and transparency and narrative responsibility, to be honest, are not optional additions at all. They are foundational. And the question isn't really whether, like I said, whether AI belongs in genomics, because it already does, in labs, in clinics, and even in people's living rooms, it exists. And so the question is rather whether the stories it tells reflect that complexity, like I've said, and the lived realities of the people whose data made that possible. So I hope that you guys have some perspective to offer after the talk. I'm excited for a little bit of a discussion. Thank you so much for your time. If you guys are interested in seeing more about what I do or where I work, what we do, then please, you can just scan the QR code. I'm doing a shameless promo here for my work. But yeah, we're super excited. We're coming out with a podcast soon as well that's hopefully going to touch on more of these topics that I've discussed today. So yeah, thank you guys for joining, and thanks for taking the time to listen to me.
Excellent stuff. Thank you so much, Erin. Yeah, I think really helpful way to I guess articulate the diverse ethical stakes as AI is integrated across a variety of human domains, knowledge making domains. But also, I think I recognize the invitation to everyone else to sort of think about how science communicator can be a site of a distinct kind of ethical responsibility. And sort of sticking on that note on ethical responsibility, I wonder, obviously science communicators are in relationships with other stakeholders, right? And so curious about that point you had made about the diffusion of that responsibility. So I don't want to make it an individual point, but I know I was to your knowledge, with the current capacities of, say, large language models, do you think we can prompt our way out of we can prompt nuance back into a lot of these conversations? Like, is it and so for example, I noticed that, I was curious about whether, like, how critical, especially with the current conversation around sycophancy and how, it's there to massage your ego and keep you there and keep your attention. What's the ratio between, say, sycophancy and criticism and critique? And so I was curious about, in the say on ChatGPT, for example, like, can you, in terms of how you've been responding to me over time, what would you say is a ratio between sycophancy and critique? And
That would be
interestingly,
interesting, actually.
it told me it's been 80% sycophantic and 20% critical.
Well, this is the thing, and I think that can be really dangerous because, I mean, especially, sorry to interrupt you, but I think just on that, it can be really dangerous because in spaces like this, like I had a slide on it right in the beginning where it was those 3 phones with everyone with some potential questions that someone might ask. I think it can be alarmingly blurred. Like AI can give you a little bit of a blurred outcome to sort of like, oh, this poor human, like they might get sad at this, so let me write it nicer. Whereas like when you're looking for fact, like sometimes this is a great example. Sometimes I use it, like I've just been diagnosed with a shoulder thing, right? I go onto ChatGPT and search. I'm like, I've got a SLAP1 lesion and a blah blah blah. What does this mean? Prompting it requires a little bit of context, I think. So, I mean, it would give me a whole bunch of stuff that's related to a hip tear, and then I'm like, no, I mean my shoulder, and then it prompts me better. But you sort of have to have that lens on for yourself to go, this is not giving me, this is stroking my ego a little bit and like trying to it's like mansplaining things to you a little bit. And once I think you can prompt yourself out of that situation to say, no, like speak to me nicely. And then it might be better. But I think it's really dangerous in a space where someone might not think or recognize that or know to do that.
Yeah.
Because I think the type of person that's using AI, you can't pin it down to one type. So
Yeah, no, true. Thank you, Erin, and yeah, I don't want to hog the conversation. So yeah, this is an invitation to you all. Any comments, any threads you'd like to pull? Yeah, maybe you could just raise your hand, or you can pop it in the chat as well. So we've got okay, we've got Lexi, and then after that Amara and Sarah. Oh, we've got quite a lot of questions. Yeah,
yay.
let's so yeah, Lexi, you can start, and then we'll move over to Amara, Sarah, and Paul.
Oh, Lexi's having issues with her mic. Maybe type it in the chat, Lexi, and then we can address.
It is.
You could try. Yeah, we
Okay.
can hear you.
Yeah.
There we
I just
go.
needed to be let in. Thank you. Well, thanks, Erin, for this. I think there is a lot to unpack, and yeah, I think it would also need multiple more conversations. So just a few thoughts and questions as well. So I think this has really kind of stilled the practicality of science communication for me as an actual practical tool, especially now more than ever, not just for genomics, but for data governance, health data governance, especially to just kind of bridge that gap in how we will ensure that there is ethical implementation of these tools in healthcare. So I think that's just one practical tool because there's always so many questions around how. I think there's the not questions per se, but conversations and discourse around how do we then ensure there's like human oversight in this, and I think that really sells it.
Yeah.
And I have to say it also really highlights the importance of co-creation. I see, like, just as you said, you're from a genomics background and similar to me. I think we can no longer be single like professionals and just say this is the only field I want to focus on. So it's really encouraging to see that even though your background is in core genomics, you're really getting out into that space to do work outside of that. And
Thanks,
so,
Lexi.
how do you think we should push other professions, other medical professions, especially considering like we don't want to shove this on people, because people are overworked and yeah, there is a
Yeah,
lot, especially in the healthcare space. So then, how do we um, kind of push others towards this agenda of co-creation in this space to make sure that there is more ethical oversight and human oversight in data governance? Mm.
I think that's a great question and something that I sort of touched on very briefly in the towards the end of my talk is that, you know, I think the first step is something that you've already mentioned, which is just identifying that this isn't sort of a one-man problem to solve, and that potentially sort of breaking out of that mold of thinking of being in a professional space where it's sort of the accepted understanding of like this is what we do and this is how we do it. I think breaking out of that mold and encouraging collaboration across disciplines is always a great starting point, and a really good space for growth. So I think just recognizing that is already a really good step in the right direction, because I just think two brains is always better than one and three is always better than two. So um, that's the first thing. But I think the second thing is just to that sort of, I think, segues off of that is that science communication, I think, as a profession has become sort of, it's a new thing for sure. It's definitely in its infancy, and I think it hasn't always been recognized as a profession, which I am fine with because I think that everyone has actually just subconsciously been doing it
Mm.
for long, and like it's sort of now getting a name, which is really cool and very exciting. But I think that just on encouraging people to, you know, explore that space, I think you just need a few trailblazers, to be honest, to like
Mm.
make it cool and get people to buy into the conversation of like working in a team.
Yeah.
um and I think that that is an easy starting block for
Mm.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks. Well, you are the trailblazer, so well done. Thank you.
thanks.
Thanks, Lexi. Amara?
Okay, thank you for your interesting talk. So I have a few questions.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate the fact that you pointed out about diversifying global AI governance, especially within the healthcare sector.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to ask two questions. Did you do a field research, or is your analysis in this talk based on any empirical studies? Because when you hold the position that Africa, let me say something like moral values from Africa, is not being included in such governance,
Mm-hmm.
is there any empirical studies that you have, or did you yourself get down to Africa, go to maybe different healthcare centers or different policy organizations in Africa to actually do a field research to support your claim? Then the second one is, you have stated the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Pardon me if I didn't get that point because my network has been on and off.
Mm-hmm.
What are the solutions? What do you suggest we should do? How can we broaden the scope of AI governance? Now,
Sure.
bear in mind that we do not actually have a global AI governance as when you talk about the ARMS Charter and rest of them.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for your question, or questions. I'll start with the first one in the how did I make that claim of Africa not being represented? I think I'm glad you asked that, because it's an important distinction that I feel I need to make quickly, in that those statements that I was making were coming from my background in genomics, where genetically Africa is an underrepresented continent. And so those figures that you might have seen in the beginning, they were full of red and highlighting that the continent isn't well represented, are from studies and from the one was from a platform called Clinvar. So those weren't generated by me. So no, I haven't gone to health centers and done any field studies or anything like that. But the claim of I mean, I'm not the first person to say that Africa is not well genetically represented. So the extrapolation was sort of to use that as the basis of understanding, to state that, it's difficult to find nuance in an AI model if the data that it's using is not representative of the person that might be using the model. And so to answer your second question, I think that it is the way we can help that and contribute positively to that space is to engage in ways of getting work out into the public. And so that might be through in research, that might be publication and getting your work out there, but also uplifting others to do the same, because it, like I said to Lexi, I think it's important to recognize that it's a team effort, for sure. I see you took your hand down but then raised it again, so do you have a response for that?
Actually, I'm just quick to in the interest of parity, we can come back to any follow-ups if we have time, but we have questions from Sarah, Parker, Paul, and then Angela. So Sarah, you're welcome to comment, pull some threads.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much, everyone, for organizing this talk, and Erin for sharing. My question is about the geopolitical landscape that we're working in, and like how the Global South or Africa can have a voice in AI, considering this geopolitical landscape. You mentioned that like you're doing research on what AI needs to be safe for Africans who are using ChatGPT to understand their genetic issues and things like that. But how does that information feed back to the people who are creating these models and like installing the value systems and algorithms that they are based on? Because you said public-facing AI must signal uncertainty, avoid generalizations, etc. And that those are things that AI could like learn to do, and probably has already learned to do. But like, how does just how do we have a voice in what happens?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the main thing is that I have that slide on sort of helicopter science where the people from the global north might come down here, do some sampling, take the samples back up, analyze it, and then be like, well, these are the findings, but not really go beyond that. So I think, to sort of sideline answer your question, firstly, I think there can be more responsibility placed on researchers and just people who are engaging with African context to report back better, because I think it would be ignorant to not acknowledge the fact that the resources in the north are fabulous. However, that being said, I think that the South also needs to not just accept the narrative of like the North is better and the South is not as good. And so in any space, I think getting your voice heard is done by speaking the loudest. And I think that you know, I can obviously only speak from the genomic space, but I think people that are doing genomics research should just like back themselves a little bit and have the narrative of, we can do it here and we are going to do it here, and so look what we're doing, and then put their work out there. So it's a similar answer to the previous question, in that I think everyone, I feel like there needs to be like a fire fueled a little bit for people who are working on the continent to be proud in their work and do their work and communicate it properly and, you know, shout it from the hilltops kind of thing. And eventually that collective effort is going to trickle down into that sort of funnel thing where you have all of the data coming in, and giving you that little golden present at the bottom that will ultimately have all those contexts and narratives as part of its decision-making process. I hope that answered your question. Sorry, I went like very around the corner with that.
It does, thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Erin. I think there was a question at some point, Paul Potsani, you had your hand up, but I'm going to take it that but I see it's down now. So maybe we can then move to Angela.
No, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, Paul. Cool.
No, thank you. My mic was not necessarily functioning, but now I'm all good. And also, I think the first speaker actually answered me because of my question was more on co-creation in the global south, particularly around healthcare sector. And, my question was more around what do we see, or what, Erin see as a critical, step for implementing this co-creation model at the scale, considering that most of the countries in the global south, they are, under-resourced, and there aren't a lot of, resources for that to happen. And most of the studies done around this area, some of them are still more at research phase, but we are not at upscaling phase. And, what can be done around that so that we can enjoy the benefits of ethics in AI developed in the global south for us, but more at the cost-effective, measures. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think that is I recognize that that's sort of what I just mentioned as well, in that there's sort of this narrative that the global south is worse off than the global north, for various reasons, or, and I think that the step that people should take is to share their research. And I can almost feel like I can say it as simply as that, is just to keep at it and communicate your research and get it out there. Because if you're doing valuable work, it doesn't help that if it sits in a silo that no one can see it in. And so I think that just loops back to the whole science communication thing, and, focusing on how can we get it out there, how can we get people to see it, and how can we collaborate with other people that are doing similar work.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Paul. Angela?
Yeah, thanks, Erin, for such a nice presentation on science communication. I love it. Yeah, I have a question on, you talked about co-creation and talking about disciplines. I'm in the socio-technical systems. So I'm focusing on socio-technical systems of AI in my research. So my question is, where do we bring other knowledges that are not disciplines? And I'm speaking from an African perspective, indigenous by design, that medicine is deeply spiritual in Africa context.
Yeah.
In Africa indigenous context. And whenever we're talking about disciplines, spirituality and the knowledges that go beyond the disciplines that we study in our universities are never spirituality or African spirituality is never factored as part of that discipline, of those disciplines. So how do we bring those nuances? Because when you're talking about personalized medicine and all that, genes, genomics, could have a nuance of spirituality in terms of how Africans interpret it or Africans interact and engage with AI. The second question would be, yes, it's a little bit of a pessimistic kind of side of a question. How do we deal with what we call dominant narratives about whose genes are superior and whose genes are inferior? Because the dominant narratives are there. They are part of what has formed histories and legacies, and they are actually very clearly spelled out in most of the current AI models and all that. And even when you claimed that we could actually bring out our research and all that, there's still a lot of gatekeeping in the research space on what knowledges get to feature, get to be told, get to be visibilized, get to be seen in current debates. And also the aspect that in most of the models of AI, there is what we call narrative control in terms of who is who and who is superior in this particular conversation and who dominates. So I think this is something that I have struggled with in my studies in terms of it's not just about shouting and saying, here I am, I have done this, and it is very important and all that. But how do the powers that be see that importance? And how do they control that narrative? How do we go about that, such debate? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll answer your second question first and then loop back onto the first one. In that, there was one word that you said that I liked, where you used the word gatekeeping. And I think, like you said, it's not just about shouting from the rooftops, for sure. But I think that everyone, and unfortunately the research space is a space where it's sort of been normalized to gatekeep your work because of intellectual property and all sorts of things like that, and wanting to be the first, and there's lots of reasons. But I do think that in the research space, gatekeeping, this is my opinion, that I think gatekeeping the work that you're doing or any of your outputs does not benefit anyone, because the only way that it will benefit people is if it is shared and work is, there's the co-creation. Like, I think there's been a strong thread of co-creation throughout this talk and the questions. And so I think just breaking that wall of science gatekeeping it's definitely easier said than done, for sure. I'm not ignorant to that, but I do just think that, we're moving into a new era, and, the research needs to move with it. Otherwise, it's going to get left behind. And then to answer your first question on spirituality and African spirituality, I think that's a very interesting perspective, specifically in our context. And that's why I think that having something like science communication, where someone can offer a level of, has the mind space and it's within their job description to think of things like that and ask these questions, is very important. And so I think that can get lost in the research space for many reasons. And I think one of them being that, when I'm sure you'll be able to agree to an extent with this, and that when you're pursuing a research question, it's all consuming. And that does often mean that some perspective might get lost in that pursuit for an answer. And so I think engaging in things like this and encouraging out of the box thinking is a good starting point in the research space, because it allows you to think of questions and get input in ways that you might not have initially considered. And so I think with African spirituality in personalized medicine and stuff like that, I think that's a space where science communication can grow and where it can be really useful in the way of telling stories and maybe communicating things in a different way that aren't part of the mold of, you know, a standard research output or a publication or something like that. So I think science communication in general is a space that is really exciting because the way of communication is vast.
Thanks, Erin. Erin, do you mind going back to the slide where you had, I think that invitation of ethics must scale with technology?
Oh, yes, this one.
Yeah, and then the next one?
This one?
Okay. No, yeah, so I mean, I'm just thinking around that as, at least for me anyways, that's sort of one of the key takeaways. And I was just trying to think about the different aspects of scale that you've sort of spoken to. And I think, you know, a scale in terms of increasing our appetite for complexity as there's, and I think, but you use nuance more in as you were speaking. Infrastructure, sort of, you know, investing, supporting African genomics infrastructure, inclusiveness. You talked about that with data sets, and then reach. So that sort of, you know, I would say, for example, maybe moving ethics out of its traditional ethics discussion is from its traditional locations like research communities to actually engaging diverse publics. But I think the one that interests me the most is probably scale in terms of speed. I can't remember the reason I was asking you to go back. I can't remember if you'd mentioned it, but I mean, there's just something about genome, the field of genomics and the seductiveness of its potential biological determinism. That you know, you don't want to be in a position of having to react to misleading narratives, right? So you almost want to get. There's something about I would say the field of genomics that almost invites a kind of anticipatory. You need to anticipate things going wrong before they actually go wrong. And I wonder if you have any, if you spoke about it. I probably missed it, but I'm curious about things. So that invitation, ethics must scale, and I'm thinking about scale in terms of speed, not correcting after narratives have already taken hold, but actually anticipating the ways things could go wrong as part of this notion of responsibility and science communication as a site of ethical responsibility that you're developing.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's speed is actually a great way to think of it in the genomic space for sure, because I mean, the landscape is expanding very rapidly. And so there is sort of the question of like, how does one keep up kind of thing with all of the new advances that we're seeing and things like that. And I think that in terms of scale in this context, I'm going to bring it back again to collaboration. I mean, you can't have the answer, you can't have the questions to all answers, and you also can't have the answers to all questions in one brain. I really think that the key to scale is, I mean, scale is the key to scaling is size. And I think if your team is big, not like within reason, obviously, but I mean, like if your team is multifaceted in that way, I think that is the healthiest environment for ethical scaling, because you just have so many such a great opportunity for perspective in an environment like that.
Okay, that's fair. Thanks, Erin. Are there any other questions in the chat? Any comments? Anyone else want to jump in? Let me check the chat.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm still here.
Oh, sorry, yes, Amara.
Yeah, thank you to your beautiful responses to all the wonderful questions. So, I'm thinking about two things when you talked about representation and recognition. Let me put it that way. So, and I, for a while, I'm thinking, why can't we situate this discussion within the history of genetics itself, where genetics, was used as a scientific justification for colonizing Africa. For example, there were research in those days that says that Africa needs to be colonized because their head skull or something is smaller than that of the Europeans. The importance of this historical grounding of this discussion is very important, so that when we talk about representation and recognition, we start to think about what kind of representation should we be talking about? Because in this context, you have seen that, especially within the historical context I pointed to, there is a kind of negative representation of Africans and as well as their values in the history of genetics. So I just want us to be mindful of that, so that when we talk about representation, when we talk about recognition, who and who should we be recognizing, in what respects? That is it. Let me stop at this point.
I think
Thanks,
that's a good
Amara.
perspective to bring. Thank you. Yeah, good point.
Erin, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. I was just going to say thank you for that perspective. I think it's a good, a very good perspective to bring. So thank you for raising that.
Okay. So I think with the time we have left, we're going to take a last round of questions from Sarah and then Lexi.
Hi, I think more of a comment, like responding to this idea of ethics at scale. And like, I feel there needs to be an institution, sort of, or an interdisciplinary space that has the specific mandate of evaluating the safety of AI for the public. But at the same time, it's like if we have all these conversations about ethics, but we're unable to institute limits, we're unable to like say, this is unsafe, and then like stop AI platforms from functioning in a specific way because those platforms are made in a different space to us and are the property of of people who don't fall under South African law. It's very difficult to institute ethics. And it's just something I'm thinking about in terms of like how fast AI is progressing and how little power we have to respond to that in an impactful way.
Interesting for sure. I think it's a very vast topic.
Oh, sorry, my mic was muted. Sorry. Thanks, Sarah. And Lexi, and then maybe we can sort of offer Erin a chance for some closing reflections and close off.
It's also just a comment, or rather a remark based on what has just been said about the historical injustices in this type of research where data is involved, not just in genomics, but other healthcare data. And so I just want to respond to what Angela had said in the chat about gatekeeping, because based on research I have done, it has become clear that that is one of the reasons there is a lot of gatekeeping, is because of these historical injustices. So then it just pushes us to think towards how do we then create a balance where we are now saying we really should share more data so that it is included in how data sets are made and how AI tools in these spaces are created and in genomics as well. And yeah, I think that is where kind of the dilemma comes in, because then how do we create that balance where we're saying, okay, we are willing to take this risk. And I think that's one point where it's really important to understand what it is communities want, because if they're willing to take the risks, then who are we to tell them no and gatekeep their data?
Thanks, Lexi. Yeah, so Erin, thank you so much. And I guess I mean, really stimulating discussion as you can tell from the sort of comments,
Great.
discussions, questions. And maybe I just want to give you the chance as well for some closing reflections, sort of, you know, you're welcome to plug your work as much as you like. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about sort of where this is going and sort of the direction you want to push some of these questions in as yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I enjoyed the discussion after the talk as well. I think lots of perspective was shared, and I think it's exactly what I spoke about was encouraging more collaborative spaces and more collaborative thinking. So just seeing that in action is really great. As for where I think I'm going to move forward, I mean, for now, my main focus is the podcast that we're busy producing. So I'm really excited for that to come out. We're aiming for May to be the release date, and it's going to be a podcast that focuses on what the genomic medicine in South Africa, what the genomic medicine landscape in South Africa looks like. I was thinking ahead of my mouth there. And we have invited quite a few guests on to speak about what the landscape looks like in their profession specifically, and to speak about challenges that we might be facing and come up with some solutions for how we can tackle those challenges. And so I think it's going to be a really revealing season, and hopefully it's well received, and I'm very excited for that to come out. So yeah, that's my main thing for now, and keep your eyes peeled for when that gets released, because coming soon.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Erin. Yeah, for really, I guess, helping us understand not just the stakes of AI in this at least in relation to science communication, but also the ways in which I guess different stakeholders within the field of science communication, broadly conceived, have a kind of diffuse ethical responsibility. And like, yeah, as I said, I think a main takeaway is that ethical reasoning, ethical thinking can be sort of a powerful tool as we navigate this new world on the horizon, and situating, helping us think about what that looks like in your field has been super helpful, and sort of articulating the different stakes in terms of what's at play, and just I guess the call to which I think is a call that can go beyond our respective fields, to just embrace nuance, right? To, I guess, resist that authoritative zeal of a lot of these technologies, and sort of embrace uncertainty, anticipate misreading, and signal limits. So as you so eloquently put. So thanks really for giving us your time. Thanks to all of you for joining today's event. You can find out more information about our future webinars on Ethics Lab website. Yeah, hope to see some of you again in future as and when topics emerge that are of interest to you. So thanks, Erin. Thanks to everyone. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Anya. Thanks, everyone.